Okay. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Jody Bechtel here, the Deputy Director for Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability. And we are here today to discuss rules under consideration for the state implementation plan, requirements for moderate non-attainment for the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And for those of you who have been with us for several of these, I apologize for the repetition of my presentation. But for those of you who are new, just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing and why we're here. So our department, through our Air Quality Division, serves as the Air Pollution Control Agency for Clark County. The contacts you see on your screen are those involved in this ozone attainment state implementation plan development and rule development process. And Lynn Hutchinson, listed there on your screen, will be providing a presentation today on this particular rule that we're about to review, which is the miscellaneous metal and plastic part surface coating. Our first stakeholder meeting on this new non-attainment designation was held on January 12th. This is the 5th of 7 workshops to review particular regulations we are looking to promulgate. These meetings are being recorded, except for one. Unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties with the graphic arts recording, but every other one should be recorded and will be available on our website. I will place a link. It's on your screen here, but I'll place it in the chat so you can easily access that. We will have time during the meeting to address some of your questions. We ask that you hold any verbal questions to the end, but you are welcome to type questions into the chat as you think of them. If we don't get to every question, we will absolutely do our best to get back to you with an answer or for further discussion. So in our January meeting, we reviewed the ozone situation that we are facing here in Clark County. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail in this intro slides, but I do encourage you to watch the video or review the presentation from the January 12th meeting for the specifics. We are in marginal non-attainment for ozone. We were in marginal non-attainment for ozone with a current standard of 70 parts per billion, and we have been bumped up to moderate non-attainment. This graph shows you kind of the trend that we've been facing with ozone in the area, in hydrographic area 212 or the Las Vegas Valley. And again, you can see over the past 20 years, we have been trending downward, but in the last couple of years, we've kind of been stuck in this mid to low 70 parts per billion, and we need to get below 70 parts per billion to get into attainment. So the bump up in classification requires that we achieve attainment by August 3rd, 2024. We must establish emission control requirements and a state implementation plan, including rule development on reasonably available control technology or RACT requirements. We are required to do a 15% rate of progress requirement and have contingency measures on the books as well. So under EPA's final bump up rule, the EPA is requiring us to submit a SIP, or that state implementation plan, by the retroactive date of January 1st, 2023. And because we are working under a deadline that is passed, we need to get controls in place as soon as possible, or we are at risk that EPA could start a sanctions clock, which could lead to loss of federal highway funds and other penalties, and also could allow EPA to impose a federal implementation plan to implement control requirements and get us into attainment. So we've identified these source categories as needing action and rulemaking under the RACT requirements. These actions and those on the next slide are the rules we are discussing in this series of workshops. We are additionally required to have show a 50% reduction in volatile organic compound emissions over our baseline, and this reduction is independent of any emission requirements necessary to achieve attainment. As well, we are required to have contingency measures on the books that would be triggered if we have not reached attainment by August 2024. These are the actions being considered for the 50% ROP or the reduction in volatile organic compounds and contingency measures. So some of these you'll notice overlap with the CTG RACT actions or rules from a previous slide. Those overlaps will be discussed in these workshops. We expect and hope not to have to implement all of these actions, and we will know for certain which ones are absolutely needed once our attainment model is completed and run sometime toward the end of April. And we are discussing all of these actions with stakeholders as if we need them all due to the tight schedule. So this table identifies the statutory timelines we're working with. Again, EPA Region 9 is aware that the SIP submission deadline has passed and therefore unrealistic, and that DAQ, our Division of Air Quality, is working closely with EPA to show good faith progress to develop the SIP and adopt related regulations and as expeditiously as possible in this year of 2023. We will review the expected rulemaking timelines in each of these workshops, which is based on an attempt, again, to get these rules in place as soon as possible in the summer months of our ozone season when we have the most exceedances. And with that, hopefully Lynn has joined us, and Lynn Hutchinson will be reviewing the rulemaking that we're considering for these miscellaneous metal parts.
All right, let me know when my screen is showing up.
We can see it.
Okay, great. So as Jody introduced me, my name is Lynn Hutchinson. I work for RTP Environmental Associates, and I am helping, as a consultant, I am helping Clark County prepare their SIP implementation plan for submittal to EPA. And we're going to talk today about the metal and plastic parts surface coating CTG recommended requirements and where Clark County may go with those rules. EPA has issued 2 CTG documents that establish recommended RACT requirements for this source category. The first was issued in 1978 and the second was issued in 2008. At the end of this session, I will add links to these documents in the chat feature for the webinar. In 1994, I also wanted to mention that EPA issued what's called an Alternative Control Techniques document, or ACT as it's sometimes called for short, that also was for this particular industry. This document does not have recommended RACT requirements in it, but it's a good document to understand this particular source category and the potential emission control options that are available. So we'll also provide a link to this document at the end of the chat at the end of the webinar in the chat function. The CTG source category includes hundreds of manufacturing operations that cross numerous industrial sectors. EPA provided examples or identification of facilities that fall under major SIC code or standard industrial classification 33 through 41 as potentially subject to RACT requirements under the CTG. These industries also make a variety of products, and so the surface coating operation production line at the manufacturing site that make these kinds of products could be subject to the RACT requirement. This list is not all inclusive. I'm providing it just as examples of the type of manufacturing operations that could be affected by DAQ's RACT requirements. The CTG source category does not include stationary sources that are part of another CTG RACT category. So for example, if Clark County promulgates regulations for architectural coatings, then those coatings would not come under this particular RACT requirement. It also does not cover auto body refinishing, fiberglass boat manufacturing, and it does not cover industrial adhesives. 2 Just to give you some background, you might be thinking, why are all these coatings used in the manufacturing process to begin with? Well, the coatings impart decorative, protective, and functional purposes on the parts that it's put on. These purposes might include resistance to moisture and heat or waterproofing. It could add aesthetic appeal, such as color or texturing to the product. It could be used to prevent mold formation, correct flaws in the underlying substrate material, and it also can be used to reduce the magnetic interference or radio interference, called EMI or RFI signals, in short. This is a highly simplistic summary of the process operations at a metal or plastic part coating operation. The first step in operations is generally surface preparation. During this step, flaws in the substrate material are corrected and the surface is prepared for accepting the coating. This step can include a cleaning with rinsing the parts with something like an alkaline or acidic solution, or even an aqueous water-based solution. It might also include sanding the surface of the substrate to improve coating adhesion. Coating is the name, as the name implies, is the step where coatings are actually applied to the substrate. This can be done with a variety of different methods for spraying coatings or paints on a surface. It can be done through dipping, or it can be done through roll coating. This step can include multiple coating phases, and after each phase, the product could be put through a drying step and then another coat reapplied. The final step in these operations, however, is drying of that coating. So you'll see potentially a curing oven at the end of the process line. After coating is complete, cleaning begins. The cleaning needs to clean the parts that are used in both the surface prep process and the coating process. And cleaning can include changing out the paint or materials that are used in a spray gun, washing or flushing the transfer lines, cleaning the interior of spray booths, and other kinds of operations. The materials that are used for cleaning are typically VOC-containing solvents. Emission sources for these source categories generally include evaporation that happens when the coatings are being applied to the subsurface and when the coatings are drying. You also have displacement of VOCs when you're doing mixing with thinners and things. So the container that the mixing is done with, the air is laden with VOCs, and when it is displaced by adding additional thinner to the container, you can generate VOC emissions. The application and drying step, also the air dryers will have emissions. And in most cases, we do have emissions in waste treatment operations, but those emissions are minimal compared to other steps. But we can have VOC emissions also in the surface prep area, storage and handling of the coating and cleaning materials. In the 1978 CTG document, EPA estimated the percentage of VOC emissions that released from various types of surface coating methods and from drying operations, assuming application of coatings with a 25% solids material. There have been a lot of improvements in the application efficiency, the transfer efficiency of the coating to the substrate since this 1978 CTG document was published, but this gives you kind of just a general feel of where the majority of the VOC emissions occur in the processes. Before I begin to talk about EPA's CTG RAC recommendations, I thought it would be useful to go over what EPA provided as guidance on what should not be subject to the RAC rule. EPA explained that general exemption of less than 3 tons per year of VOC should be exempt from the rule. And most states have incorporated that 3 tons per year as an applicability threshold in their RACT rules. Some of the states base that applicability on actual emissions, and some of the states base the applicability on potential emissions. EPA also said that generally research and development facilities should be exempt, quality control operations, performance testing at research and manufacturing facilities should be exempt, aerosol coatings, architectural coatings, and automobile refinishing, as we previously discussed, would also be exempt from the RAC requirements. Now let's move on to talk about what EPA recommended for control requirements. In 1978, for each major type of coating that EPA identified through a variety of research, the CTG recommends emission limitations in terms of mass of VOC per volume of coating applied. In 2008, EPA retrospectively described the 1978 document as creating daily volume weighted average VOC content limits, which excludes water and exempt compounds, and it's as applied. Now, that 2008 description of the 1978 document is a retrospective interpretation, because if you actually look through the 1978 document, you'll not find the word daily and you will not find the word averaged used in that document. But nonetheless, I pointed out because that is EPA's current interpretation of what the 1978 document requires. Essentially, RAC consists of VOC content limits for the coatings ranging from 0.4 to 4.4 pounds per gallon, depending on the kind of coating that's being used. EPA also noted that surface coaters could use add-on emission controls, and it named incinerators and carbon absorbers, but did not provide specific control efficiency or percent reduction expectations in that 1978 document. It talked about what those things can achieve, but in the RAC recommendation, it merely identified add-on controls as a potential alternative to the VOC content limits. The 1978 CTG recommendations did not include any control methods or control requirements or VOC content limits for cleaning materials. That brings us forward to 2008. In 2008, EPA set 3 different alternative approaches for meeting potential RACT CTG requirements. Option 1 involves complying with VOC content limits for the coatings on a mass per volume of total coating applied. It also includes requirements to use specific type of application methods to assure a good transfer efficiency of the coating to the substrate. It also includes work practice requirements for general operations and for cleaning. EPA recommended that the VOC content limits be met on an average based on that daily average across a single coating line and not an average across multiple coating lines. That was EPA's recommendation, but in the 2008 document, they also pointed to separate guidance should a state want to consider cross-line averaging. EPA developed several sets of emission limitations for various parts of the industry, including the metal parts coating, plastic parts coating, automobile, transportation, and business machine coating, pleasure craft, and pleasure craft coating. For the metal parts coating, EPA recommended separate emission limits for baked versus air-dried coatings. Each of these categories are included in a bunch of tables that are in the CTG. This table includes the requirements for metal parts coating, and EPA expressed the emissions limit in terms of mass of VOC per volume of coating applied. This first table, again, is for metal parts. Now, the next table, which you might notice at the top that it says table 3, and this is only the second table that I'm going over. I cut and paste these out of EPA's CTG document, and their CTG recommendations started with table 2 in their document. So we'll be off one table number as we go through talking about the different limits here. But this table applies to plastic parts coating, and this can involve surface coating of such things as toys, sporting goods, outdoor signs, and architectural structures such as doors, floors, and window frames. Here I have pictured a bicycle, which would come under the sporting goods category. Table 4 covered the automotive and transportation sector, which include surface coatings on interior and exterior plastic components of automobiles, trucks, tractors, lawnmowers, and other mobile equipment. The business machine sector includes plastic housing for electronic office equipment, computers, copy machines, typewriters, although I don't know anybody that actually uses a typewriter anymore. There might be some still out there. It also covers medical devices and musical instruments. Although coating of automobiles at light-duty truck or auto assembly plants is exempt, or EPA recommends they be exempt from this RACT rule, EPA, however, did make special note that motor vehicle cavity wax, sealers, deadeners, caskets, sealing material, underbody coatings, trunk interior coatings, bedline and lubricating wax, and compounds used at facilities that are not assembly plants would be covered by the RACT requirements. And this table includes those limits along with the limits that would apply to pleasure crafts or recreational boats. So those are the VOC content limits that are included in EPA's option 1. Part of option 1, as I mentioned, was following a required coating application method. Those methods include electrostatic application, HVLP or high pressure low volume sprayers, flow coating, dip coating, airless spraying, air assisted spraying, and equivalent methods to HVLP spray methods. That moves us along to option 2 in the 2008 CTG requirements. Option 2 sets forth equivalent VOC emission rate limits based on use of a combination of VOC limits and add-on emission controls. It also requires use of the specific application methods that I just went over under option 1. The recommended emission limitations are expressed in terms of mass of VOC per volume of coating solids. So these VOC content limits differ from option 1, which was the total volume of coating used, whereas this one is the amount of coating solids in the material. These recommendations or this option is for those who would use both add-on emission controls and also use VOC content limits. And EPA made note that there are no alternative limits in this option 2 for the motor vehicle VOC content limits. So I'm just going to page through the slides and you can refer back to these in reference, but these are the limits that EPA set forth under option 2 for VOC content. That brings us to option 3, which is using only a control device as a means of complying. EPA required that in consideration of both capture and control, the overall control efficiency under this should be 90%. The facility would not have to limit VOC content of its coatings. It would not have to use any recommended application methods, and it would not need to use particular kind of coating application methods, which is what I just said. EPA recommended that the all VOC containing material, including those in thinners, other additives, and the coatings, be included in determining whether the coating unit emission line meets the 90% control efficiency. Now, I talked about exemptions earlier, but when you go through the 2008 CTG, it actually talks about even more exemptions, not complete exemptions from the rule, but exemptions from parts of the rule. So I'm going to go over those now. For metal parts coating, EPA would exempt stencil coating, safety indicated coatings, solid film lubricants, electric insulating and thermal conducting coatings, magnetic data storage disk coatings, and plastic extruded on metal parts from the requirements to meet VOC content limits. The application methods and the work practice requirements would still apply to these types of coatings. EPA would exempt from the application method requirements touch-up coatings, repair coatings, and textured finishes, but would still apply the VOC content limits to these particular coatings. For plastic parts, again, EPA provided a list of types of coatings that it would exempt from the VOC content requirements while still requiring compliance with application methods and the work practice requirements under the standard. So I have here abbreviated HBAC, and that stands for heparin benzyl acrylamide chloride containing compounds. And these are typically used in medical devices. So, and the EMI RVI is what I talked about with the electromagnetic and radio frequency interference dampeners. For plastic parts coating, EPA would also exempt the airbrush operations from the application method requirements. For automotive and transportation and business plastic parts, EPA recommended that the application methods and work practice requirements apply, but not the recommended VOC limits for the following types of coatings and operations. So I've alluded to these work practice requirements a number of times through this presentation. I'm going to talk about them now. So in addition to the VOC content limits, the application methods, and any add-on emission controls, EPA would require facilities to meet work practice requirements. EPA indicated that the VOC emission reductions would likely not be quantifiable by following the work practice requirements, but they nonetheless felt that these were just good operational measures to take and that there would be an obvious impact in reducing VOC emissions. The specific recommended approaches would be storing all coatings, thinners, and coating waste in closed containers, closing the mixing and storage containers when they're not in use, conveying VOC materials in a closed system, whether that be pipes or containers, storing cleaning materials and captured solvent, waste solvents, used rags in closed containers, minimizing spills of VOC containing material, and avoid atomizing cleaning solvent when using solvent to clean equipment. Now we're going to talk about some rules out there that DAQ is looking at as potential models for what they might do under their CTG RACT rule. In the materials distributed today were rules for Kansas and Pennsylvania. Now the Kansas rule predates EPA's issuance of the 2008 CTG, or simply chose not to follow those requirements. It pretty much is modeled after the 1978 CTG recommendations. It includes requirements for the basic rule based on PTE. If you recall, I said some states base it on PTE, some states base it on actuals. The Kansas rule would base it on PTE. And to determine PTE, EPA would look at maximum hourly production, not EPA, I'm sorry, Kansas would look at the maximum hourly production rate of the coating system, calculated on 8760 hours to measure that PTE. The Kansas rule requires inclusion of thinning additions to any of the coating materials in judging whether they meet the VOC content limit requirements. If you recall, I mentioned that EPA's 1978 CTG did not include specific emission control efficiency or percent reduction requirements for those add-on control devices. Kansas includes a 90% requirement, similar to what we see in the 2008 CTG. They do use a daily weighted average for demonstrating compliance, as EPA had interpreted their 1978 CTG by 2008. So we have a couple of questions for you relative to the Kansas rule. As I said, the Kansas rule is based on the 1978 rule, and it's significantly less complex than what we see when we bring in all the elements of the 2008 CTG. At first glance, DAQ would probably not be inclined to follow the Kansas approach, but we really do have a limited number of stationary sources that we've identified from the 2017 National Emissions Inventory. We think there's likely additional sources out there, potentially a large amount of emission sources that we don't have actual emissions information on, but to the extent that the 2017 inventory is representative, there's only about 24 tons of emissions per year out there in this industry. So the 1978 CTG may be a reasonable, cost-effective approach for DAQ to consider to move forward with its CTG requirements. So this leads us to consider the Kansas rule and ask additional questions. So one question we have is, would adoption of a rule like Kansas actually result in any additional emission reductions? In 1988, EPA put in place an NSPS, and in 2004, EPA put together a NEAQS, or National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, that might overlap with the kinds of industries that would be regulated under the CTG. And so we're wondering if DAQ were to take the approach in the Kansas rule, would it actually do anything out there for the environment? Is following the Kansas PTE approach to applicability reasonable? And are the methods in the rule for calculating PTE appropriate for this industry? Are the product categories and emission limitations appropriately defined, understandable, and meetable in today's formulation and coating applications? EPA defined those categories all the way back in 1978. They might really be quite outdated to what is going on in the industry, and that would be certainly something that we would not want to adopt moving forward if that's the case. And finally, I've raised a couple of times EPA's interpretation that the 1978 rule is a daily weighted average approach, and that is the approach that Kansas followed in their rule. Is this appropriate? And if not, what other kinds of averaging or averaging timeframes would be appropriate for DAQ's rule? The next rule that we're going to talk about is in Pennsylvania. Now, I haven't conducted a line-by-line checklist comparison of the Pennsylvania rule, But as I glanced through it, it appears that the Pennsylvania rule closely followed to the T EPA's 2008 CTG recommendations. It provides the 3 methods for complying that EPA recommended. It includes charts identical to those outlined in the earlier slides for each kinds of specific subclasses of the category. It requires add-on emission controls to meet the 90% emission control requirement, and it applies the CTG recommended work practices. It also exempts facilities based on actual emissions. So this contrasts with the Kansas rule, but it lowers the level from 3 tons per year to 2.7 tons per year on a 12-month rolling average basis. It does specify that if more than one limit applies to a coating, so if you have a coating that could come under multiple tables, the lower limit would apply to that coating. It does require submission of a plan for installing and operating add-on emission controls that would have to be submitted to the Air Pollution Control Agency and approved by them for using those add-on controls. And getting back to that averaging period, I searched through the Pennsylvania rule and I could not find reference to an averaging period at all in the rule. It's possible I simply just missed it in looking through the rule, but it could be possible that Pennsylvania is implementing it on an absolute basis, meaning that every coating that is used needs to meet the limits in the table. I simply don't know and will need to follow up with Pennsylvania should DAQ decide to move in the direction of doing something similar to the Pennsylvania rule. But we're asking for comment on this, and perhaps there's users out there with operations in Pennsylvania that could quickly answer the question or have opinions on whether the Pennsylvania's approach, if it's an absolute limit, is appropriate. Pennsylvania rule does add 2 further clarifications that are not in EPA's CTG. I've included the specific regulatory text here, but basically it's trying to identify coatings that might not fall within one of the tables. And basically it directs that if you are a metal coater and you're not in one of the tables, then you should follow the general 1 component coating or general multi-component coating limits that are in the metal coating table. And if you're a plastic coater for the pleasure craft coatings, and you're not in a specific table, you should follow the table for all other pleasure coating, surface coating on metal or plastic limits. So we have some questions about the Pennsylvania rule. Pennsylvania includes a number of definitions. Are they appropriate and are they reasonable? Pennsylvania includes record-keeping requirements, which essentially requires MSDS sheets or formulation sheets from the manufacturer. This seems appropriate, but we're asking the question whether there are additional or whether the record-keeping requirements in Pennsylvania's rule are overly burdensome. EPA does not put monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements in their CTGs. So these are areas where the states have a broad degree of discretion to ensure that what they adopt as RACT is practically enforceable. It should, DAQ, include the additional clarifications that I just went over on the slide before. And should applicability be based on the actuals approach followed by Pennsylvania or the potentials approach followed by Kansas? If it's based on actual emissions, how should DAQ address the fact that the types of solvents and the quantity of solvents could vary from year to year, and in any good year, 1 year could trigger applicability and another would not have enough to be above that 2.7 actual emissions threshold that's in the Pennsylvania rule. So are there methods for addressing these kinds of changes? I mentioned that one of the work practice recommendations that EPA made was to minimize spills. And while this is something that we think is logical and should be done, it is also something that is not highly descriptive. And I hate to write rules that put a regulated entity and the regulator at odds as to whether the method was followed or not. So we're looking for potentially recommendations on how to further clarify the specific actions that a owner or operator should take to minimize spill emissions. And finally, are there any provisions of the Pennsylvania CTG RAC recommendations that are inappropriate for inclusion in DAQ's rule? And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Araceli.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and check the chat. I don't believe we've received any other comments at this time, but I also want to allow others to ask any questions, and you can do so by raising your hand, and I will go ahead and allow you, enable your microphone so that you can speak, or you can feel free to post a comment in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and give a moment for that.
Araceli, there does look to be a question in the chat box on the Nevada SIP submission. I didn't read totally through it, but there is a question out there.
Yes, I can go ahead and address that question. Jody responded to it. Jessica says that it appears that EPA has disapproved Nevada's SIP for the 2015 8-hour ozone. How will Clark County's timeline fit in with NDEP's resubmittal of that SIP? And Jody responded that the processes can and will be taking place separately or independently of each other, but we do coordinate with NDEP regularly as part of our SIP process. And I believe the SIP, the disapproved SIP that Jessica is referring to, is the interstate transport SIP for Nevada that the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection prepared on behalf of the state. I'm not seeing any other questions. Lynn has provided some additional documentation here in the chat. So feel free to utilize this area to retrieve information. And then Jody posted earlier in this chat box a link to our ozone attainment page, and we have a variety of materials that we have been presenting to stakeholders available on that webpage, and we will continue to update it as we move forward in this process. And it looks like we're getting a chat right now that's going to come through. So it looks like it disappeared. Eugene, did you have a question? If so, you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, and then I can enable your microphone. Okay, doesn't look like he has a question. Well, hearing no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this presentation, but I have a couple closing slides that I'd like to share, so bear with me for a moment, please, while I share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so yes, as Jody mentioned earlier, we are working under a very aggressive schedule. The timelines EPA has placed on us has forced us to adopt a fast-paced schedule for implementing these rules, and we would need to adopt them so that they would produce emission reductions for the 2023 ozone season. This rulemaking timeline is the most aggressive schedule we're looking at. We would be aiming to implement these rules no sooner than July 4th, 2023. So if we were following this scenario, the proposed rule would be released for 30-day public notice on April 9th, and that would end on May 9th. Then we would be scheduling it for hearing and approval by our Board of County Commissioners on June 20th, and then it would become effective 14 days later on July 4th. And this slide just basically restates what I just said. Those of you who have registered for our respective distribution lists will receive updates on the development of these rules, but you can also follow and our other plan developments using the link right here on this slide, and also that's been placed in the chat box. And we will continue to keep it updated as this project moves along. And then finally, we just want to say that we will continue to engage both industry and other interested parties in the development of our attainment SIP. Questions can be directed to any of the individuals on this slide. If we can't address your question, we can forward it to the person that can. So I'm going to post this information in the chat box so that you have it. And this presentation will be up on our website. It should be up on our website later today, if not early tomorrow morning. And then again, if you wish to receive notices on plan developments and have not signed up for our distribution list, you can email Alejandro Nunez, and he will and he can add you to our distribution list. And with that, I don't have anything else. Is there anyone else that has anything to add? I'm not seeing any. Yes, and I'm not seeing any further comments.
Yeah, so we look forward to hearing from anyone and everyone that might have comments. Please do reach out to us with questions, concerns, or suggestions. We really appreciate your participation, and stay tuned for more information. Thank you so much and have a good day.